Good evening. Hi. Thank you for joining us. So we want to thank our sponsors tonight, the Drescher Center for the Humanities, the American Studies Department, and the Media and Communication Studies Department. So this talk is part of the Humanities Forum series of events, and I want to encourage you to take a look at the other events in the series, either on the flyer we have available or at the Drescher Center website, dreschercenter.umbc.edu. I also invite you to attend the next Humanities Forum event, or the next group of events, on December 3rd, which is a Saturday, starting at 9 a.m. in this very room. There's an all-day culminating event for the Baltimore Stories Project, which is partnered with the University of Maryland College Park and is funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And check out the website for the day-long host of programming. Also on Wednesday, December the 7th, the 10th Annual Corman Lecture, which is featuring our own, the Chair of Gender and Women's Studies, Carol McCann, who's giving a talk called Figuring the Population Bomb, Maoism, Masculinities, and Demographic Transitions. And that should be an exciting talk as well. So again, thanks for coming. And friends, these are uncertain times. These are times when we need the power of the humanities. We need the power of our stories. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleagues, my friends, my comrades in the fight for knowledge, power, and justice. Michelle Stefano. Michelle is a visiting assistant professor here at UMBC. She also is a folk life specialist in the American Folk Life Center at the Library of Congress. And Michelle has partnered with Bill Shoebridge, who is a professor of the Caracas, and the Department of Media and Communication Studies here at UMBC, and he is the director of the extremely important New Media Center. So before I turn it over to my comrades and my friends, I just want to say a few words that I believe that listening is a radical experiment in empathy. Also, listening is hard. Talking's easy. I love to talk. Listening is hard. And we have some hard work in front of us for sure. So in these times, we need empathy. We need stories. We also need to ask the difficult questions, and we need to fight for the things that make us human, the things that connect us. Since 2012, with the closure of Sparrows Point, Bill and Michelle have been working hard with our students, with community members, collecting stories, editing those stories, bringing them back to the people, asking if they're getting it right, and that's really hard work. And deindustrialization is a serious issue that we must face on a local, a national, and a global front. So we should never allow, and I say this especially to my students in the room who've been in my class over the past few weeks, we should never allow our economic needs to trump our humanity. Because friends, I still believe we are all in it together, and that's why we're here tonight. So I turn it over to my friend, my colleague, and my comrade, Michelle Stefano.
Thank you. So I do have a PowerPoint to show you. Keep it a little interesting. Let's see. And it's on. Thank you so much. Okay, I forgot. The first slide is black. So, yes, I think so. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic showing tonight, and no less is it due to, like Nicole was saying, these hard times that we're in. I want to stick to a script. Those who know me know I tend to talk without reading, but I'd like to read tonight, especially the words of an author whom I love and who has helped me these past couple of days. So, thank you. I must also say, unfortunately, that I am speaking as an adjunct professor here at UMBC and not a government employee. In light of the election and indeed our social, economic, political, and cultural trajectory as a nation over these past several decades, I would like to take a moment to contextualize the film before we screen it, as well as the larger project, Mill Stories, from which it grew. Over the past couple of days, I've felt lost. I'm sure some of you have as well. Maybe felt like you're in a daze. Maybe you're still in one. But I returned to my bookshelves to read and remind myself of the values and beliefs with the help of writers, poets, and journalists, all great thinkers of the past and present. A particular passage that has helped me today, ideas and sentiments I couldn't articulate any better, comes from the 2010 book, The Death of the Liberal Class. This is written by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges, who ran the Middle East Bureau of the New York Times and was fired by the New York Times for speaking out against the war in Iraq while delivering a speech to the 2003 graduating class of the Liberal Arts College, Rockford College in Illinois, at which some people started booing and administration cut his mic. As stated on the book's dust jacket, for decades the liberal class was a defense against the worst excesses of power. But the pillars of the liberal class, the press, universities, the labor movement, culture, the Democratic Party, and liberal religious institutions have collapsed as effective counterweights to the corporate state. In its absence, the needs of the poor, the working class, and even the middle class no longer have a champion. The death of the liberal class has permitted the rise of a new and terrifying political configuration. While he takes the reader through the entirety of the 20th century, arguing why these pillars of the liberal class are and were so important, and chronicling their collapse and the rise of neoliberal / corporate / proto-fascist power, I will read an excerpt from the last chapter entitled Rebellion. You may think I'm being gloomy, but hang with me. I have a feeling you guys will hang with me. There are ways forward, and it certainly connects to this film. I'm sure you're already connecting the dots now. The corporate state is now, and this I'm reading, this is Chris Hedges. The corporate state is now as cornered as the rest of us. The decimation of the working class and increasingly the middle class means that corporations must employ ever greater levels of corruption and coercion to continue to increase profits. Human misery is being compounded. Indeed, it in itself is viewed as a source of profit. All essential elements for existence offer corporations the potential for profit. The demand for capitalist expansion in a time of growing scarcity and environmental collapse means we will endure harsher forms of abuse and repression. By silencing those who clung to moral imperatives, the liberal class robbed itself of the language and analytical means to make sense of the destruction. Liberals assumed that the engines of capitalism could be persuaded to exercise a rational self-control and beneficence, a notion that would have gotten anyone who proposed it laughed out of the old militant labor halls. The liberal class, seduced by the ridiculous dictum that the marketplace could be the arbiter of all human political and economic activity, handed away the rights of the working class and the middle class. Even after the effects of climate change became known, the liberal class permitted corporations to continue to poison and pollute the planet. The liberal class collaborated with these corporate forces, and did so with stunning gullibility. The short-term benefits of this collaboration will soon give way to a system's collapse. The true militants of the 20th century, American 20th century, including the old communist unions, understood, in a way the liberal class does not, the dynamics of capitalism and human evil. They knew that they had to challenge every level of management. They saw themselves as political beings. They called for a sweeping social transformation that would include universal health insurance, subsidized housing, social reforms, and worker-controlled factories. And for this, they were destroyed. They were replaced by a pliant liberal class that spoke in the depoliticized language of narrow self-interest and pathetic Buy American campaigns. Our collapse, economic and environmental, I'll add cultural, might not have been thwarted by anarchists and others, but at least someone would have fought against it. The liberal class was useless. The coup d'etat we have undergone is beginning to fuel unrest and discontent. In 2010, he writes this. With its reformist and collaborative ethos, the liberal class lacks the capacity or the imagination to respond to this discontent. It has no ideas. Revolt, because of this, will come from the right, as it did in other areas of bankrupt liberalism in Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Tsarist Russia. That this revolt will be funded, organized, and manipulated by the corporate forces that caused the collapse is one of the tragic ironies of history. But the blame lies with the liberal class. Liberals, by standing for nothing, made possible the rise of inverted and perhaps soon classical totalitarianism. As communities fragment under the weight of internal chaos and increasingly dramatic changes caused by global warming and economic despair, they will face a difficult choice. They can retreat into a pure survivalist mode, a form of primitive tribalism without linking themselves to the concentric circles of the wider community and the planet. This retreat will leave participants as morally and spiritually bankrupt as the corporate forces arrayed against us. It is imperative that communities nurture the intellectual and artistic traditions that make possible a civil society, humanism, and the common good. We will have to grasp that we cannot alter the larger culture around us, at least in the short term, but we may be able to retain the moral codes and culture for generations but beyond ours. As those who retain their identity during slavery or the long night of 20th century fascism and communism discovered, resistance will be reduced to small, often imperceptible acts of defiance. Music, theater, art, poetry, literature, dance, and the humanities will be the bulwarks that separate those who remain human from those who become savage. And I'd like to add to this the public humanities, a term used for what I consider the application of our scholarly pursuits and skills to prioritizing those who are most affected by, most vulnerable to, the forces of neoliberalism / unfettered capitalism, and who have the least access to resources to fight against these forces. We ought not to write only for ourselves and to present to each other as academics enjoying the remaining yet diminishing safety of the liberalism that Hedges argues is dying. But we must start to help amplify the voices and experiences of people, groups, and communities, voices that are being increasingly dimmed or rendered mute, more so than us. The Mill Stories Project represents a small step towards complicating the picture of American boom and bust, disturbing that oversimplified narrative as presented in the media and elsewhere, as well as adding nuance and texture and humanity to the now ubiquitous working class communities category bandied about during election campaigns. New slide. The project began in late 2012 following the closure of what was once the largest steel mill in the world, Sparrows Point, once located on a peninsula jutting out from Dundalk just across the Baltimore City border. Owned by Bethlehem Steel for the majority of its 125 years, up until 2001, it underwent a succession of owners in its final decade before its doors were finally shuttered in 2012. At its height, during post-World War American industrial dominance, roughly 33,000 workers were employed at the point. In its last years, this number dwindled to roughly 1,500. The film you are about to see was never meant to be a film as our first aim, Bill and I. The project sought to research and document the significance of the mill, as well as the sociocultural impacts, using a humanities lens, of its closure from the perspectives of those who know it best. Intimately tied to this aim was another: to raise awareness of and promote these memories, stories, and broader significance of the mill and of industry to wider audience, the public humanities angle. Through its website, millstories.org, community-based and public events such as this, and eventually this film. 2 years ago, Bill and I realized that there was a longer film that could be shaped from this documentation, based on interviews with 40 Sparrows Point workers, associated personnel, and surrounding community members. And the film has proven to be a poignant way in which the human face of industry can be promoted, connected to the broader discourses on deindustrialization's aftermath. We're happy to say that it has been screened in several festivals in Europe, and of course here in the US. It also received a Telly Award last year. Nonetheless, from the start of the project, Bill and I wanted to help foster a sense of ownership over it on behalf of Sparrows Point community members who wanted to be involved. Short digital stories based on the interviews were first screened for community feedback and discussion at the Mills Union Hall on Dundalk Avenue in the spring of 2013. Work that UMBC students, maybe some of you are here, have helped to produce. And not only were they learning how to conduct and of course the ethics and theories and practices of cultural research and documentation, but they also were learning, thanks to Professor Shoebridge, how to edit and make and produce and film and light what eventually became those digital stories that are found on the website. And they also worked on other projects and got some good press. This is the front page of the Baltimore Sun in the spring of 2013, just below the news about the Pope resigning. So that's not bad. And also worked with other professors, Professor Nicole King, Stephen Bradley, and their students on looking at the broader patterns and experiences of deindustrialization in the Baltimore region. And since then, we have organized community screenings and discussion events throughout the Baltimore area, as well as bridging the project's themes to other places in the region, like I just mentioned, thanks to the work of Professors King and Bradley. So Bill and I would like to let the film speak for itself, but hopefully it becomes evident just how intimately these women and men have come to know the forces of global capitalism and neoliberalism, as well as what is worth fighting for in these times. You may not be able to tell, but several steelworkers are looking beyond the interviewer to UMBC students, the next generation, who are there and speaking to them about the importance of the labor movement, working in middle-class jobs, and our future. So there's a photo from one of us all together, 2013, interviewing Troy Pritt, who was featured in the film. So I think I'll leave it to the film now and let go.
So I guess at this point, we're here to take any questions or anything, any observations you have about the film. And there is cookies. There is cookies. So, but hopefully it's observations and then cookies. But anybody? Yes.
Or in the larger community of Sparrows Point, were there other businesses besides Bethlehem Steel? I mean, like, were there companies that made asbestos gloves, or were there other independent businesses that contributed to the making of steel, or did Bethlehem control the whole
At the point as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about the background of the community of Sparrows Point? I think it came through in the film. At one time, the actual the town of Sparrows Point was a company town, so it was actually owned by the steel mill itself. I'm not aware of any additional companies.
I mean, there were other manufacturers.
Yeah, there are,
such as
right.
GM,
But on Sparrows Point, there is a concrete factory there now that was there when the mill was there, which is a separate entity. There was the shipyard, which was owned by Bethlehem Steel at one point, but it became kind of a separate company as well. And at the end, there was still actually some work going on in the shipyard. I don't think it was actually shipbuilding they were doing, but there was it was something other than at different points in time. Yes, there had been different companies that were working there. So in the background.
Is there still community there at Sparrows Point, or is it sort of non-existent? Like my parents and I were talking about it, and I go, "What's Sparrows Point?" Because my parents go, "You weren't aware of that because it was around when they moved there. Then they lived in the 90s and 80s, and they saw the whole thing, and then they saw it go up, and I was a little kid."
So you want to talk about
yeah,
the community?
well, there's no mill anymore.
Right.
So it's been dismantled, imploded since 2012. So these past couple of years, I think what is now coming in, is it?
Trade Point Atlantic is there
Yes.
now, and then,
Was it Amazon
Under Armour,
warehouse?
yeah, right, yeah.
But there, I mean, of course, there are steel workers who are, that still work
Yeah.
there, who are still alive, and they not only live in that region of Baltimore County, but live Harford County. I mean, once the highways started getting built in
Right.
the 1950s, they could live further away.
It-
So
it-
yes, I mean, the living heritage of this place is still very much alive and enduring.
And as they talked about at the beginning of the film, in the 70s, the company owned the houses. They rented it to the workers, but they closed down the town so they could, move the new steel plant, the new furnaces into that area. So that town was, right, exactly. So the town of Sparrows Point was actually obliterated at that point.
A guy from Baltimore City, and so it's like in my mind, Dundalk is sort of part of Baltimore City.
Mhm.
Like my dad, his friends lived in Dundalk. They had a mechanic shop down there. They still do.
Oh, sure,
And so we
yeah.
would go down there and get a car fix, and you would, or we'd go drive around there to go someplace, and we'd drive past part of the mill, or drive past some giant.
But you couldn't go into it at that
No, I
point,
remember driving
yeah.
Past some big giant thing down.
Yeah, access was very limited.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Industrial area, it's totally gone. There's nothing.
So a lot of the steelworkers did live in the Dundalk area, but it was spread all through Baltimore. It really affected every neighborhood in the city at one point.
Many of the African-American workers lived still there, historically African-American
Right.
neighborhood of Turner Station, right south of Dundalk, and as well as West Baltimore and throughout the city. Yeah.
In the film, you said that the mill was destroyed in 2015, but you said 2012 on the film.
So Bethlehem Steel was the owner for the majority of its life since the late 19th century. It went bankrupt in 2001, and since then, between 2001 and 2012, there were 5 owners. And these are supranational corporations. One was
Right.
Russian, and so we can
Yeah.
talk about those allegiances to nations. They don't really have any. They're above the patriotism.
Could you tell us about the history of workers' protest at the mill? Were there any significant strikes? And was there, like, at the time of its decline, was there still a strong culture of, you might say, ardent or even militant unionism?
Well, I mean, at the time the mill closed, actually, a lot of automation had come online. It came on late at Sparrows Point, but it did come on, especially with the L furnace. And I think they were down to maybe, as Bill Berry says, 2,000 some active steel workers, and that was down from 30,000 at its peak. In the 50s. So there was still union activity at the end. I mean, in fact, when our first introduction down there, when Michelle and I first went there, we went to the Union Hall. At the time that the final closure happened, it just timed out that way. We just happened to be there at that point. It wasn't really,
Maryland traditions.
Yeah, Maryland traditions. Thank you, Maryland traditions. But at that point. It was kind of some interesting conversations going on between the workers and the unions, because frankly the workers felt not only that they had been deceived by the government and had been let down by the government and had been let down by the state, by both parties, but also by the unions as well. They felt like they were deserted at that point. So it was a very complicated kind of environment to try to pull things out of at that point.
But there were many strikes over the 20th century.
Yes, starting in, I
to
think,
fight slowly and to implement change, whether that's safety, for as Joe Roselle talks about the respirators. Joe is young,
right,
relatively
yeah.
speaking. So that wasn't long ago. They were fighting for respirators and things like that. It was maybe not militant that you would hear about it on the news, but.
Okay.
But
Well, in the
their
50s,
way.
there was actually
Yes,
some
yes.
very major strikes
Yeah.
that
And
shut down.
the gentleman Don Kellner got locked up in jail 3 times, so
Right.
they were fighting.
I guess I'm just trying to figure what the sentiment was amongst workers, and what power they felt they had as the mill was at its deathbed.
Hmm.
But I think you explained.
I think the last 10 years was really the union, they really were looking to the union to try to save some aspect of their pensions. That was like really practical things. And the litigations are, I think they're still going on in some levels in a lot of these cases. The workers were able to recoup, I think, a small percentage of their actual pensions through litigation. It's an interesting history to see, you know, the four companies that sort of turned over as it went. When it was originally sold, the company that it was sold to would only buy it under the condition that they would not be held liable for the, you know, the pensions and the costs. So at that point, it was a mess, and still is. So we'll go here and then there, over here.
A question about the litigation. So you mentioned that some of them were able to get a portion of the back. Is that like quote unquote justice? I mean, I guess to what extent are you, you know, legally owed all promised pensions by your employer when they go bankrupt? I guess?
That's an open question today, isn't it? Yeah.
And then just one last small question. I spent some time by a steel mill in Brazil and the surrounding city. You know, pretty much daily, depending on how the winds were, you would have like your balconies covered by kind of like this fine.
Yes,
like,
particulate matter.
Yeah, particulate.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if that was kind of part of the surrounding area of Baltimore, you know, having
Is,
this.
is there anybody here from Spears Point's community? I think there might be a few. Yeah. Do you remember this? Like when?
Red dirt.
Yeah.
Covered with it. Red dirt.
Yeah. Everybody talked about it. You just sort of.
Covered with red
Perfect
dirt.
sneeze.
Yeah. And it would just be, you know, that I've heard several people, you know, say the same thing about the laundry, and just so the practicalities of having to live in this environment. You know, they had to adapt.
Yeah,
And,
hose me off from outside they told me that my mother and grandmother did from playing outside.
yeah. Wow. Anybody else? Yes. So all the way in the back.
Okay, just a comment here. I am a spouse of a retiree, and I too lost benefits, but I just think it's remarkable that the Steelworkers Union is still in existence, and who they're supporting is the Sierra Club, and they're supporting the college football players. And I just want to know who's funding that, because as a steelworker's wife, we paid lots of union dues, and now we get nothing. And it's just a comment and an observation. How
Right.
come they're still in existence and the employees aren't?
Right.
Well, it's an international union,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It is.
But the colleges are international in the United States.
Yeah, I don't know that they're funding those. Yeah.
You can Google the United Steelworkers webpage, and it'll tell you the industries and the things that they are funding. Just that.
Yeah.
Great. Oh, thank you. Over here.
I worked with the for 27 years, and just to comment on the successors, the Bethlehem. The first group were two New York bankers, the Ross brothers. They held it and flipped it in less than 4 years, and of all the $5 billion that the workers lost, they got $2 billion profit. So our benefits went to two guys.
Right.
I moved down here in 1990. I gotta say that Beth Steel was, from a working standpoint, probably the best thing that ever happened to my company and myself. And it goes back to the gentleman's question early on in terms of were there other businesses there. And there were tons. I mean, the thousands of people that Beth Steel employed, there were thousands of people that made a living because Beth Steel was there. And so, you know, when they went bankrupt, it impacted not only Beth Steel, but the workers, the neighbors of Beth Steel, but all the suppliers.
Right.
And all the customers, because millions, hundreds of millions of dollars were lost by those folks who made a living selling product into the steel company and buying product from the steel company. There were many, many steel companies there that bought steel from Beth Steel and then turned it into some kind of finished product and then resold it. So it was kind of this living, breathing organism that supported not only the workers, but this whole community around there for years and years and years. And so when the investment group came in after the bankruptcy, the International Steel Group, ISG, it was a big deal that they did that. And they were really successful. I mean, they bought it for pennies, but they did really a lot of good things. And it was really unfortunate that they decided to take the money and run, because it really was at that point, from a supplier's perspective, there were things really starting to crumble with Severstal, the Russian company,
Right.
and Mittal Atoll, the Indian company, which I think was the final owner of that.
Yes, I believe so.
Just gutted it and abused the whole organization. So it was a crime. And then when they finally let it go, you know, the instructions were to cut holes in it. Because Air Products was one of those feeder companies that made a lot of money on it and supplied gas that needed to get, for the furnaces and things like that. You know, they came in and, you know, they just basically gutted it so that if there was a buyer out there, it just wasn't gonna happen anymore because they took the guts out of it.
Well, yeah, we've heard a lot of this kind of stories. So can I ask what your company did?
We're an electrical parts supplier. So, you know, we lit it up.
Yeah.
You know, they
Yeah.
made breakers, they bought.
And we talked to a lot of electricians that actually
Yeah,
worked on it.
yeah.
But I mean, the ripples were just felt,
But all
obviously,
the
for the whole community.
You know, they had tons of trades, they were all there. You know, they talked about the plumbing,
Right.
plumbers were in there, you know, what contractors of every imagination were in there working to support that and making a living because that steel mill was there.
Right, great. Over here.
In your research, did you ever interview any legislators or government officials about why they didn't do more to get their perspective on what happened to Bethlehem Steel?
We never really went there. I think we were always, given the nature of how the project started, it was always the idea of we really wanted to capture the voices from the community. And it wasn't until later when Michelle and I realized that it would be better served if there was a little context here, so that the folks outside of the community could these stories would resonate with a wider audience. And that's why we brought in Deborah Rudisill and Bill Berry to sort of talk a little bit about it. Even though actually Deborah, who actually teaches here at UMBC, grew up in the community, so she was of the community, but had also written about it as well. Bill was a labor historian who had done a lot of work there with the steel workers over time, so he was very familiar with it. There's that's another film. We were actually approached by several. Helen Bentley's office contacted us about she really big advocate for the port, wanted to talk about it on camera. We respectfully declined that. We just didn't want to go there because at that point, you're sort of opening it up to a lot of different interpretations that we just thought was beyond the scope of what we were trying to do. So.
Yeah.
Yes.
Given the environmentalist point of view of that, because they had a whole lot of respiratory problems, health problems and stuff with the mill from the stories, do you think that that had a lot to do with the company going bankrupt? I mean, not bankrupt, closing down?
I don't know. As far as the remediation, the environment, I know it's something that,
the dust, they were saying that people was getting asbestos and all of that, and all kinds of other health problems going on with that big magnitude of a country, company, I'm thinking that because of that, that it could have closed down because of the lawsuits and stuff that the people had against the company.
We haven't really heard that.
No.
I get what you're saying. I mean, it makes sense. There
And-
were a lot.
And it's been certainly an issue
Peter
with
Angelos is-
with moving, yeah,
That's
right, exactly. yeah.
why he's so wealthy.
They've contacted us as well. But that's been a big issue with, I know with Trade Point Atlantic, and it has been one of the reasons that things have been so slow as far as redeveloping the land down there, has been, having to remediate the environmental issues that are there, because the contamination goes down, I've heard like 50 feet at least in the ground. They don't know what's there. I mean, this was operating for 100 years, and they were just dumping everything, into the ground. There's no records of it. You just sort of find it. In the early days of Trade Point, when we were down there, I was talking with them, and they were finding benzene leaching out on the beach, down there. So it's something that they're still, dealing with, and they will be for probably the rest of our lifetimes. Yeah. Anybody else? Over here.
The film mentioned how that the Bethlehem Steel was sort of slow to sort of take on modern technology. Was that because of just like the amount of money it would cost to implement all those technologies, or was it just that they were resistant to it, or even like would if they had implemented more modern technologies, if that were probably around towards the end towards the 90s and 2000s, would that have sustained the firm, or would that just have made it go more belly up even quicker?
Who knows? I mean, it's there's like so many factors that were in play at that point. Something that always resonated with me is, again, I always come back to what Bill was saying and Deborah was saying about how slow U.S. industry was to adapt to new manufacturing techniques. That had a lot to do with it. The healthcare issue was huge. Apparently, going back to the Truman administration, they were talking about, universal health care in this country. We never really came to terms with it here. So that was passed on to the companies, and that was on the companies' backs. So of course they were operating at a disadvantage at that point.
My dad is self-employed, but from what he does, he is music. He can't go and talk and get fixed without him coming out of work, and then that means that we don't get money in our account. So it's sort of, I sort of understand the idea of when you have all these costs, it means people can't work, and then and it means you're not feeding people, or that it just costs a ton of money. So my dad has their health insurance, and my father and I do, because my mom works for our church, so I have health insurance through my mom's job. My dad has health insurance totally separate. He has health insurance.
Yes.
So I know the film mentioned that there were many casualties by accidents that happened at the mill. As time went on, were more safety precautions added to the mill, or was that
Well, probably for the first 50 years of the mill's history, there weren't any safety precautions. In the early 20th century, I'm sure it was much worse there at that time. Do you have anything to say about it?
About how dangerous it was?
The safety precautions that were.
Well, we learned a little bit about it. Joe Ed was very into. Joe Ed's the one who said he was young when they made the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge. He was a person who, within the union, was on the safety team that would help to, fight for the improvements, regulations for workers, but also to promote knowledge of acting in ways that you could protect yourself amongst, employees. It just was very dangerous. There were so many moving parts. Look physically, like cranes going by, things swinging. I mean, many of the workers told us about how, you just have to keep your eyes open. And also Darlene Redeman, she's in the pink shirt, mentions we're all best friends because we watch out for each other. She really means that. It's not just your own eyes, it's your coworkers' eyes and ears that help you as well. So many reasons why it was insanely dangerous. And why they were compensated well as well. Because I know people could die. Yeah.
Just an interesting point to bring up. A lot of what we'd heard was people knew the risks, and yet, it was sort of the deal they made. They were willing to do that, and so anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, please.
On the question of safety.
Yeah.
Things change gradually, then relatively quickly. when the union negotiated the ability to shut down operation if it was unsafe.
Right.
And that worked, the mechanism for it was any worker could claim an unsafe condition. The operation stopped, it could push stop. Union officials, management officials from the safety department got together and resolved the issue or worked out the details of it. But when the union got that control, it made a difference.
If you go to our website, there's actually a lot of additional materials from the steelworkers. And there's actually someone, I'm blanking on his name, who did the CAC with us.
Jerry.
Jerry, right, okay. Jerry's last name is?
I forget.
I forget what it is.
Sorry.
But there's some great stories that there are on the front page. It'll come to me in a minute. That are narratives of some of these stories about safety in some of the tragedies that have happened at the steel mill, and they're very, very poignant to listen to. Even in taking every precaution, when you're working around these kind of environments, things happen.
I worked for 10 years in workers' compensation.
Right.
Reviewing and dealing with all workers' comp cases. And the deaths of some of those people was really terrible.
Yeah. And that's what we heard too.
I have a question for that gentleman. After they instituted the new union program where they would stop work, was there a reduction in injuries and deaths?
That's one that over time evolved to become very, very concerned about safety. There were regular safety meetings every week. I managed a testing laboratory. And every week, we stopped work, we got together, and we discussed any concerns and any new regulations on safety. So safety was elevated to a pretty high level, and the deaths and the injuries fell.
Yeah, they did.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Seven.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You mentioned the small amount of pension that had been recovered. I was wondering, what's the source of those funds? Is that coming from an insurance company, from the government, or from
I'm
a
not
private
really sure of the
corporation?
details on it. I think it was negotiated, the state actually had something to do with it, but I don't know if it came from state funding. Do you know?
It's the Pension Guarantee Board.
Yeah, Pension Guarantee Board.
By Congress.
Right.
What happened?
So it's the federal
mechanism for
government,
that
yeah.
was any funds that the corporation had when they declared bankruptcy went to the federal government. But that's never been enough, so the taxpayers pay the balance.
But it's not the full.
No.
It was
I
never
just
the
want
full
a third.
amount. You got a third.
One a third out of the
Wow.
whole.
Yeah. So, sure.
What's interesting about that is, I don't know if you remember, there was a big party, not that many years before the bankruptcy, where as a result of the stock market rise, that there was a huge celebration of pension funds.
Yeah.
And then I guess it was the stock market,
Right.
collapse or whatever, took that fully funded celebration and, just turn a light out.
Oh, sure.
As a comment, I know it's not in your film's charter, but when a company goes bankrupt, especially a large manufacturing concern, all the partner companies get hammered and hit, the small businessmen, all the organizations around it. But there's another side of this too, and it's the shareholders, the bondholders. They also get pummeled too. You can look at the recent GM bailout. A lot of small folks got hammered. The Whoops bonds, Washington Public Power System in Washington in the Northwest during the 1970s, decimated families who had bet the farm on it. So,
Right.
It's a expansive problem that it's not easy to resolve.
So there's something else over here? Ahmed, yeah.
I mean, we see a lot of industry that's going overseas and outsourcing that's happening right now. A steel mill that's operating in the U.S. has to pay $25 an hour in insurance, health benefits, housing in some cases, in pension, retirement, life insurance, as opposed to $3 a day in China or anywhere else, like in the eastern part of the world. What are we doing to save all these industries and help grow industry? I mean, which we're not seeing any growth right now in industrial fuels and big corporations.
Well, the planet is, steelwork can still happening. It's just not here in the U.S.
Right.
as you identified.
I mean, Apple is making their phones in
Yeah.
China right now, it costs them $100.
There's no
for a
allegiance
phone,
to
but,
American
I mean, if they
workers.
make
It's
it
the
in America
irony.
And try to sell it to any other country, it'll cost them like $500 to make it.
Right.
So, and what are we doing to save our industry, American industry?
And one of the other ironies is,
The politicians want to focus on it, so it's apparently not what we're talking about. And I mean, from my perspective, that's partly why people, like, in terms of, like, he's like, we're gonna save these industries, he said we're gonna.
Absolutely.
And then they voted for him.
Of course.
And, I mean, part of that's like, is it like, whether or not you can actually save those industries, but like, it's like, coal is certainly not something that's viable, but steel definitely is really important. Steel makes almost everything in the world, from like pots and pans to like giant skyscrapers, you need steel. And even if you don't, then you lose that resource.
Absolutely.
Well, what you have to do is, if you're a country and your costs are too high, which, let's say, making steel in America right now is, then we, the people, have to decide as taxpayers if we're going to subsidize so that, it works out. You can't, and most people in this country don't, who's going to Walmart? Pretty much just about everybody's going to Walmart. We lost all the, all the mom and pop stores or the local stores, whatever. And, but you can't it's not an even playing field.
No,
And
it's
so to
not.
make it
It's a race to the bottom.
You've got to involve the government, and, we don't really want to, we don't want our taxes higher. We don't, it's tough. And it's sad to see things change as they have, but, there's not an easy answer. Somehow you have to get people in China and all these other countries to really understand that they should be asking for a lot more money to even things out, but, and it's happening slowly.
One of the ironies is I have a colleague who has told me that in China, the steel industry in China is facing a lot of the same issues now, and they're closing steel mills in China as well. So, yeah.
So you mentioned that it went bankrupt in 2001. How many employees did Bethlehem Steel have at that point, do you know?
In 2001, I'm not sure. I think Bill says in the film like 2000, I think.
I think he means by the end in 2012.
He means by the very end?
I've heard 1,500 by the end.
15 by the end.
But I would say a couple thousand, maybe
Yeah.
several thousand. That's a great question.
Right.
Probably knew at one point.
So then the other one reference point we had was somewhere in the 50s, there was as maybe as
Yeah.
many as 33,000.
Yeah.
Along that point, was there, like in 1970, was there a drop
Oh,
of
yeah, it was
20,000?
slowly
Or was it-
declining.
was it
I'm
slow, or was
sorry.
it a great big cliff?
I recommend Mark Reuter's book on the whole history of Sparrows Point, just so you'll get all these details. But it was just a slow decline. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly. But, that was definitely the peak and the golden years, and never ever.
But it was a combination of things. It was the economic things, but also the automation that was
absolutely.
eventually coming online at the very
In
end.
the 80s, they started with the lump sum, buying people out.
That's right, that's
Right.
right.
That started then.
That's right.
So what are some of the future projects? I mean, sure, you could repeat the same scenario with GM, or you name your
Yeah.
factory that's shut down here, but
We're
are there
gonna do
other
you on
things
the
that you'd like to explore?
Well, we've actually been talking, I think, what we found over the past couple of years in taking this around is that these stories resonate in other communities as well.
Sure.
So,
Other
there's
countries.
certainly a lot of work to be done, in a broader, we have the whole Rust Belt saga, which has certainly become, very foregrounded. Not that it shouldn't have been before, but it certainly is now. You can't ignore it. So, yes, Frank.
One thing, it's sort of a comment, I guess. I've been trying to figure out how to say this, but I'm struck by a kind of, in there, Deborah mentions about the whole industrial boom being kind of a bubble, and I heard actually that being discussed on the radio in terms of this economy recently, that so there, and they mentioned this fantasy island idea, so that the whole experience that was happening when things were really good was not ordinary, not sustainable, really. And I worry a little bit that there's some romanticization going on about life there. It's true, the experiences are
Right,
true, and the grief is true and all that, but the sort of larger context seems like it's a little bit missing, like this, and not
Yeah.
to mention just industrial economy and at all. My understanding is that a lot of people emigrated to Baltimore, from West Virginia, and all that.
Mhm.
were
Oh, yeah.
From the
planning.
Carolinas
Once they're
that were
there,
brought
they're
up.
basically prisoners,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
that's what
Yeah,
else
yeah.
are gonna do.
Especially during the
And
war.
then dependent on that company and the global economy, and then when that's gone, you're left hanging, as we see,
Mhm.
because the government doesn't sustain that. So, it seems like, I just was a little bit struck by the emphasis on the sort of loss and the emotional.
Well, again, that's where we
attachment to
started, and it was
something
a point
that
it started to,
yeah,
for the
yeah.
stories coming
Yeah.
from the community, and that's what we heard, and we sort of talked
It is.
there and moved on from that. So, yes, there is a tendency, and that's a common criticism.
Well, see,
that we've had,
it is, but
to
not
romanticize.
romanticization, which I
Right.
totally get. But it's nostalgia.
Yeah.
And, you know, just from working with steelworkers and talking to other people who have similar projects in other parts of the world, there is nostalgia.
Oh, yeah, no,
They wouldn't go back
generally.
there and work tomorrow, but they're damn proud of it, and they love it, and they want to tell the story.
Right.
And so, you know, Nicole brings up this wonderful notion of dignity in decline, in industrial decline, but also that we're, you know, as human beings, our dignity is being attacked. But there is a dignity in there as well. It may be painted as nostalgia or appears as nostalgia, but they're proud of these stories. They, you know, and they are nostalgic.
Well, yeah, their lives are invested.
Yeah, and there were good times. I mean, Hambone, Darnell, would go on his days off.
Right, well, that was a little extreme.
Well, it wasn't though, from, you know, from the larger data set, if you will, in this research project. I mean, these segments are whittled down from 30 to 45 an hour.
And everybody's,
interviews, yeah.
everybody's story was different. I mean,
Yeah.
it depended on where you were in the process. Some of these people did spend their entire lives, you
Yeah,
know, working.
and their
as a-
families.
Others, you know, when this happened, you know, it happened like, you know, in their 20s or 30s. We've had some of them, like Troy Pritt, would tell you it was the best thing that ever happened to him when Bethlehem Steel closed, because it gave him an opportunity to go back and pursue his college degree, and now he's working on an MBA. And, you know.
And yet talks about it like it's
Yes.
his family. He's the gentleman who said, we're like soldiers, we march in every
Yeah, I
day.
was gonna
Yeah.
say that the
Yeah.
parallels with the military experience.
Mhm.
Right. Oh, sure. Yeah, most definitely. Yeah.
For conducting the interviews themselves,
Yeah.
how did you approach the people, and did you ask them questions, or did they just, you say, here, the camera's on?
No.
you're comfortable saying
No, it takes lots of time, well, as much as we can take. But the project started really, it's a long story, but the State Arts Council, the government, has a program that honors cultural heritage in the state, including places that are important. The mill just closed in August 2012, and for that award program, we had nominations from the public to honor the mill. And two of those nominations came from Deborah Rudisill and Bill Barry, who provided the context in the film. And so they were fantastic connectors. They already have trust within the community from their own work. Bill Barry is a labor historian and worked at the community college, Dundalk Community College, and taught many of the steelworkers in his classes. So we piggybacked on that trust that they built. Pretty much in the beginning, and then for the past 4 years now, have built our own rapport with you know, people I consider my friends. So in terms of setting up an interview, that's all talked about ahead of time. Are you comfortable? There's a lot of consent giving. And then, of course, we don't spring a camera on them. We
No,
talk about it.
not spring a camera.
No, but it changes things. It makes
Yeah.
people nervous.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It does. Even an audio recorder. You know, so sometimes, you know, Dustin was, you can't hear me. But, he was a student, and he interviewed some steelworkers when he was a student. But initially there's nervousness. But then once those stories, that nostalgia, that pride starts coming through, then, I mean, there's a comfort that is gained.
It was actually kind of interesting, because it's a little different than we would do in a regular, typical documentary or journalistic kind of thing, in that we had students with us. They had
That's
an
right,
audience when
yeah.
we were doing these interviews. And I think the steelworkers, for the most part, really appreciated that.
Yeah.
I mean, it really evolved into them talking
To them.
directly to the
So
students.
they felt comfortable, or they felt more comfortable having an audience.
Yeah, especially the
Right,
younger
because they want to tell
generation.
their stories.
Yeah.
And they told, well, again, visit the site. I mean, some of the wonderful comments that were made by people like Don Kellner to students, you know, saying, I'm
Worry
really
about you.
concerned for your generation
Yeah.
because, you know, of where we are. And it was just, there was just a lot of poignant moments like that
Yeah.
just didn't make it into the final cut of the film, but they're on the website. So, over here.
So there was a mention of the Golden Gate Bridge, and I guess
Yeah.
back then there wasn't a buy local kind of movement.
Yeah.
Was there any talk about how that contract ever got made between the East Coast and the West Coast?
That's interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, we sort of you know, took his comment a little bit out of context. I think a lot of the steel that was made for the Brook, when I looked at it a little further, actually came out of Pennsylvania. I think it was.
But there is that pride of the
Right.
larger
It was
company.
Bethlehem
And so
Steel.
what he's saying is Bethlehem Steel built the
Right, yeah.
Golden Gate Bridge, and I worked for Bethlehem Steel.
And I also think that he's not talking, when he's talking about the new bridge, I think he's talking about the Oakland Bridge. He's not talking about the new Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, I think he's really.
Sparrows Point produced Golden Gate Bridge steel.
Yes.
That was the only it was the only plant in the United States
Mhm.
that was on the water.
Right.
So the only way to ship all that steel was by ship. Rail costs would have been huge.
And Bethlehem Steel actually owned their own shipping line at that point, too. Yeah.
For a while, then no
Yeah.
longer.
So, great. Yes?
So one of the things we had mentioned was like the dignity that was generated in this field of labor. Did any of the former employees contrast the dignity they felt working at the mill with whatever job that they got afterwards?
Well, at the time the majority of these interviews were conducted, they just, you know, the mill just closed. So it's really only Troy, and I know Lettice, who joked about once she saw her paycheck, she didn't have a fear of heights. She was looking, at the time of the interview, so this is spring 2013, she was looking for a job at Camden Yards in the service industry. So it was only really Troy whom we followed post losing his job into the University of Baltimore. That's where his interview was taking place because he became a business student. So no. And that is something I'm interested in. It's
Yeah.
kind of like a follow-up.
You really could do a lot.
You know,
tracking
what's
on
going
this.
on. You know, the longer term, not study, but
Again, for a lot of people, it was early retirement. It was, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
if you're, you know, of a certain age, like late 50s, it's really hard to reinvent yourself,
And
especially in this economy.
One thing we do need to add to the end of the film is that Darlene Redeman has since
Yeah.
passed away. She unfortunately had cancer and passed away this spring. She's in the pink shirt.
Pancreatic cancer. Well, if there's no other comments, or I invite you to have cookies. Cookies and water.
Thank you so much.